Well, thank you very much for this warm welcome and the excellent presentation. I couldn't have summarized the career of Angela Merkel better than you did. Thank you very much. Now, as you can see on the screen, my idea would be to start off by sort of giving a little bit of an overview why the perception of Angela Merkel as a leader of Europe is so important, and what kind of echo her departure is causing. Then I'll talk a little bit about the elections as they just took place in Germany and the immediate consequences that they generate. And Markus Thiel, I think, will elaborate a little bit on the foreign policy and in particular the implications for the EU. And afterwards we can have a common discussion on all those issues. Now, international media are still full of comments, and there are a lot of expectations and apprehensions, actually. What will happen after Merkel? Will she leave a void? Will there be a vacuum? What is Germany's role going to be in the European Union and on the world scale, actually? Okay. So, as has been said, she has been there for 16 years, which is really a long time, even on international standards. She has negotiated a number of contentious international crises and issues, and she's recognized as a deal maker. Many people think that she is a very good negotiator. She was recognized on the last EU summit, which took place just recently, about 10 days ago. The head of the European Council, Mr. Michel, called her, it is like Paris without the Eiffel Tower or Rome without the Vatican to have an EU Council without Angela Merkel. Of course, this is a little bit hyperbolic, but I think it describes a little bit the impact that people see. Or the Austrian Prime Minister said that she was seen as a calm anchor during stormy seas. And President Obama even made a statement in saying that she was a very principled, reliable leader, putting personal interest aside. And one of the key words that was coined by the Luxembourg Prime Minister was that she was a compromise machine. Now, for me, that expression doesn't sound very nice, but what he meant it in a very positive manner, meaning that she was always ready when it was needed, even at 1 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning when there was a deadlock in EU negotiations. She was there and she brokered the deal. I don't like this machine, because she is a very humane person. I met her several times, and she's very down to earth, very pragmatic person. She has a lot of humor, actually, which is recognized by many of her parliamentarian friends. And well, notably, she is a successful crisis manager. I think Markus Thiel is going to go back to that as well, looking at the European front, what she has been through in the also in the opinion polls concerning the different crisis management periods. Concerning, for example, the EU financial perspective negotiations in 2005, the financial crisis, the Lisbon Treaty negotiations also before that, the migration issue in 2015 and beyond. Brexit, of course, was a big crisis again in 2016, and we're still living with the consequences. And the pandemic, which, well, surprised everyone. And the management in Germany was recognized as being quite well coordinated so far. Some people say that Angela Merkel did not really have a strategic vision, but that she is pragmatic, and she was, as I said, a deal maker. But I would argue that she had a very clear view of what the priorities are. And her maximum sort of priority was to not divide or split the European Union. I think that was her strategic goal, number one. And she sort of made all the other decisions in recognition of that. And I think it can be argued, we can discuss that, but that's definitely my opinion. And the new leaders in Germany will have to deal with the current problems like in Poland, Hungary, the migration issue, which is still pending, climate challenges, and how to deal with Russia and China. All these are aspects which need to be dealt with after her. Now, maybe you want to help me with the slides? Push one forward, and we will just take a little look at the economic balance sheet of the period of Angela Merkel. When we see the GDP per capita, we've seen in the years 2005 to 2020 an increase of 42% or even more than that. If we look at the public debt per capita, that has risen also by about 44%. Unemployment has gone down by 45% almost. Military spending has gone up by 90%. We can come back to that maybe later on, why that is the case. Tax income has increased by 63%. Bankruptcies, insolvencies of companies have gone down by almost 60%. The foreign trade surplus, has altogether risen by about 13.7%, but with a lot of variations in the meantime. And one of the interesting issues also, greenhouse gas emissions have been reduced by more than 25% since she took power in 2005. But all that is relative in terms of the needs, how much we need. And I think many members of the Green Party would argue that this is definitely not enough. If we go one slide further, even one more, we can see that, for example, Deutsche Welle has made an analysis of what the main topics were during the reign of Angela Merkel, what was discussed in German Parliament during her time as Chancellor. And you can see that security was a big issue. I would think that this was certainly the case after 2013-14, in particular the Crimea crisis between Russia and Ukraine. We have the EU as a big topic, which actually is a permanent topic because EU and sort of Germany is intertwined with the EU so much that everything in daily life almost has something to do with the EU. Climate environment, as you can see, is also high on the scale, and that even if that has not been sort of in the center of the discussion early in her period, but only, I would say, in the past 5-6 years more intensely. Energy has been a big topic, in particular after the Fukushima accident in Japan, when she basically, and her party and government decided to go off the nuclear energy, to stop nuclear energy, and to invest heavily in other alternative energy like wind and solar, which nowadays in Germany, sort of the German energy consumption is provided by almost 50%, or 47 or so, by alternative renewable energy resources. And of course, you see the migration issue, which has flared up after the 2015 crisis, and the gesture, which was interpreted as being a very humanitarian we can do that. As she said, we can even take 1 million people, whereas other European countries were arguing about 20 or 30 people to to get into the country. But that, of course, was a difficult decision, as was the energy decision, because it was not beforehand coordinated with the European partners. So we can see today that these discussions are still lingering on. Financial crisis, we might see an increase of that issue in the coming years again because of the sort of aftermath of COVID and the different measures that have been taken, COVID being linked to that. So this describes already to some extent the priorities or the topics that have been discussed during her era. One of the things I wanted to bring up, which is maybe not so well known, is that Germany for a long time, Germany for a long time has been considered as a economic giant and a political dwarf. That's a quote from some political analysts. But at the same time, if you look at some of the reputed institutions for nation brand indexes, or for which actually is a soft power evaluation of a country, Germany for years has been ranking in the top positions. And actually for the past 5 years in the Ipsos Anhalt Nation Brand Index has been number one in the past 5 years, and in 2 additional years during the reign of Angela Merkel. So out of her 16 years, Germany was 7 times number one, which is an indicator of different factors that are sort of taken into account. Obviously, the economy is a big thing, but also the management of immigration, for example, governance and culture categories are being looked at. And if you look at the way that compromises are being negotiated, and if we're just now in coalition talks in Germany to form a new government, that is an element of political culture which is extremely valuable because otherwise you are in a deadlock. I can remember when I was in Belgium in the years 2010, 2013, after the elections, the government, the parties that could form a coalition government just didn't get it together, and there was no Belgian government for almost 2 years. In parentheses, many Belgians consider this was the best time ever, but that's another story. So maybe we can go to the elections now as a sort of starting for the immediate consequences of what happened recently. You probably know that the Social Democrats won with around 26%, followed by the CDU, the Christian Democrats, with about 24%. Then we had the Green Party with about 15 or almost, and then the Liberal Party, the FDP, with around 12, closely followed by the AfD, the far right-wing party, and then the left-wing party dropped down below the 5% level, which is usually required to be represented in parliament. But since they acquired a number of direct mandates, they were still allowed to be represented in Bundestag, in the parliament. Now, the good news about the elections, I think, is that the center, the mainstream, won. The extreme parties lost, both the AfD on the right and the left party. The high participation of the in the election was remarkable as a sort of stabilizing a trend after the past elections and after a low in the elections before. It was now about 76% participation, which I think if that happened regularly here in the United States, people would be very happy. The fact is that many young parliamentarians are now introduced into the parliament, many people under 30 years or even under 25. That's a new factor which brings a new dynamism into parliament. On the other hand, the results are actually sort of witnessing a certain volatility of decision-making by the voters, and the link of voters to the parties is diminishing. That is, people used to be traditionally SPD voters or traditional CDU voters, but that's no more the case, as we have seen huge movements between these parties and other parties. So that's another characteristic. The elections have been largely personalized as well, which can be seen also in the campaigns. They were largely made around the persons, and sort of one irony of the story is the person who did not speak much and who didn't make any mistakes won. Well, that is Olaf Scholz, whereas the others were quite active, also in public, but also made a number of mistakes in the public perception. And that finally led to some spectacular moves in polls, I will show later on, which made the main parties lose a lot of ground. And another sort of negative factor which I would cite is that the AfD became the strongest party in two East German states, in Thuringia and Saxony, with more than 24% of votes. That needs to be analyzed a little bit further to cope with that issue. And finally, we are now living with we're having the biggest parliament ever, I think, in post-war German history, with 736 members of parliament. And you have to know that there are 299 electoral districts only. And for each district, you have two candidates. One is voted for directly as a direct candidate for the district, and the other is sort of decided according to the percentages that the party list gained in the election. But as we had more direct candidates elected than the percentage of the parties would allow, these get automatically through and get a seat in parliament. But in order to compensate the other parties who do not have that advantage, they get also additional seats, which means that instead of having 598 seats, which would be the normal sort of 2 per district, we now have 736, which is considerable, and makes life difficult in Parliament in sort of pragmatic terms. Yeah, maybe we can go a little further, even to this one here, maybe. Oh, I meant the one before. Yeah, this one. Here you can just as a reminder of what I said before. There was an extreme volatility also in the polls during the year, during 2021. In the beginning, the CDU had almost 38% in the polls, but then, as you can see, there is a almost constant downturn. The Greens have a movement up until April, and then a downturn again. And the SPD, the Social Democrats, are very low in the beginning until the summer. Even in August, they were under 20%, and then all of a sudden, after the summer, they rose up to 26%, which is due to certain factors. Like in April, the candidates there was a candidate debate within the Christian Democratic Union, which was very sort of hostile within the party. In addition, the Green Party candidate Annalena Baerbock had a problem with her tax payments and with her book that she had written, where she had copied without making it clear which parts were copied. So this was at the advantage of Olaf Scholz, who didn't say much in the beginning, but who didn't make any mistakes, and that's why, in the end, the SPD won. To say it, sort of be it a little bit polemically. Now let's just briefly brush through the next slides, which are just demonstrating the downturn of the traditional parties in the since the 1980s. Well, here you can see right now the ascension of the Green Party, which has gone up since the 1980s quite drastically, whereas SPD and CDU have gone down from size of about 40% almost down to the mid-20s now. And this, of course, will be a fundamental issue in German policy for the next years anyway, to see how this political spectrum will develop further, whether it will still specialize or compartmentalize, or whether there is a movement towards the center again, which will consolidate these mainstream parties once more. And probably it's going to be a personality issue again, as we've seen with these elections. Now let's go to even further. This is the AfD, you can see. This is FDP, the Liberals. They have gone up also considerably again after a low and being thrown out of parliament. And the Left Party actually also now is in a crisis because they have fallen below the 5% hurdle. Well, I think they're now discussing how the party can continue. And let's turn to Europe. It is clear that Germany is really in the center, in the middle of Europe, geographically speaking, but economically, it's the heavyweight also of the European member states. Germany pays, I think, still more than 25% into the EU budget as one member state out of 27, and therefore has also a power situation which the others are quite aware of. But as there are 27 members and there are a number of decisions which have to be made in consensus or with a ponderation majority, there's always a need to have partners on your side and also to think in the long term, because like in a negotiation, when you're always in the same group sitting around a table and sort of you win a debate with unfair methods or in unfair manner, the others will remember that next time and they will not allow a compromise. So that is part of the strategic negotiation principle that you need to take into account when you are discussing European politics. Now, I would say in general we can expect in foreign policy areas a strong continuity as far as the mainstream policies are concerned. However, we can expect some debates about the financial aspects also of the European Stability Pact, on which way that is going to turn, more lax or remaining very strict about the current mechanisms. Migration is going to be an issue which is contentious. The climate issue, as you are probably following, the Glasgow conference is ongoing, and the story currently is we are not doing enough, and whatever will be decided in Glasgow will not be enough. So there has to be a discussion afterwards. What can we do? Defense is, of course, an issue. Also the question European versus NATO defense cooperation. And actually it doesn't have to be versus, but it should be complementary. So there are ongoing EU-NATO discussions, but also a strong wish of some countries like France to get a more autonomous way of managing defense policy. But that also goes together with capabilities, which are much more on the US side. The relationship with Russia and China will play a role, obviously. There are many issues which are being discussed also between Europe and the United States. An interesting debate currently ongoing in the coalition talks is, will the foreign ministry be combined with the development ministry, as is the case in some other countries, like in the United Kingdom, where there's a foreign and cooperation ministry. But my sort of hunch is that that will not happen, because the activities of the development ministry and of the foreign ministry are, although they overlap to a certain extent, they are quite different. And the lobbies also for the two areas are different. And as there are three parties who want to have ministers and state secretaries, the more ministries you have, the more posts you have available. This is just my guess. So maybe we can just have a short look at the personalities. This is most likely the next chancellor, the successor to Angela Merkel, Olaf Scholz. He has been the key player for a global minimum corporate tax, which was recently endorsed by the G20 summit. And he actually accompanied Merkel to the EU and the G20 summits, which is also sort of a signal or to the others what sort of democratic culture in Germany is, that the outgoing chancellor takes the likely next chancellor, even though he's a completely different party, with her to present him already to the big players. I find this is very reassuring that this kind of thing is happening. And also, if you see the organization of how the coalition talks are organized, very, very strict agenda. The work is going to be presented on the 10th of November, so already next week. There's supposed to 22 working groups are going to present their papers, and then they're sort of finalized by the headquarters of the parties. And the likelihood is that we will have a new chancellor by 10th of December. Otherwise, Angela Merkel will become the longest-serving chancellor in German history. If she stays until the 17th of December, she will surpass Helmut Kohl, who is the record holder for the time being. Now, then we have the next personality, which is Robert Habeck. He is one of the two party chiefs of the Green Party. He is being sort of vented as a possible finance or climate change minister. And he's competing for the finance ministry with the FDP candidate, which I'm coming to in a minute. So these personality discussions are already taking place. The next one is Annalena Baerbock, so the female counterpart of the chief of the Green Party. She's a candidate for the foreign ministry in particular, but possibly also for a climate ministry, depending on different other choices, because nowadays a previous head of the Green Party sort of Cem Özdemir, who is a native Turkish citizen who came with his parents to Germany. He is also being considered for the foreign ministry. And last but not least, Christian Lindner, party chief of the Liberal Party, the FDP, certainly wants to be the finance minister, that he has expressed very clearly. Possibly that will have to be sort of negotiated at the last minute, and he might also take an economics ministry, for example, but something linked to the economy certainly. And other persons in his negotiation team, the Secretary General of the party, Wissing, for example, he might be an innovation, science, or research minister. All these things will be discussed in the next weeks or so. But I think we shouldn't lose the sight of the big picture, which is we have a transition phase from one government to the next. We have the obligation of the parties to find a compromise for a coalition treaty. Otherwise, they will not be able to govern. They will not have a parliamentary majority. None of the parties can govern alone. So we need at least 3 parties to govern. And I think they have that in mind in order to come to a conclusion in not too long a time, and not to take as long as they did in 2017-18, where it took almost 6 months to get a government together. So I'll leave it at here for the moment, and maybe I have already talked too much, but Markus Thiel, I think, will follow up on the European aspects in particular.
So mostly, some of you had me already in classes and seminars, so you know that I sometimes like to use political cartoons or pictures, right? Because they can tell more than 1,000 words, and I'm trying to limit it to 15 minutes or so, because I'm sure you have a lot of questions about the two of us for a number of things. So this is just a little collage that I didn't do, right? I don't have that much time, but as you can imagine, but that shows you, I took it from the internet, there's no source, right? So never do this, right? Always provide the source for whatever you take. But this is a nice collage that shows you some of sort of the myths and the different representations of Angela Merkel, right? Myth Merkel. Everything from when she started out, and I remember there was this sort of, wasn't she called the girl, das Mädchen, by Helmut Kohl, her mentor and former predecessor, former chancellor from the Christian Democrats, right? She worked herself literally up through the party hierarchy to become sort of this towering figure, and of course, I think also trailblazer for a lot of women in politics that didn't want to necessarily go down the Margaret Thatcher or Indira Gandhi route, right? But you have here, obviously, sometimes despite her constancy in her behavior, and most of the time, not always, in her policies, right? There's different facets, and sort of the media likes to represent different things. So, for example, you have, of course, probably the Person of the Year. Time magazine put her a couple times on there, right? I think at one point she was called the leader of the free world after Donald Trump got elected here in the US, right? And we were pretty leaderless in terms of international liberalism. Then you have up here Mother Angela, right? A reference to Mother Teresa, I guess, so iconic. But it says on the bottom of the Spiegel magazine, Merkel's politics divides Europe. Okay, so that is a hint. I'm not sure exactly when that was, but that could have been around the Greek Euro crisis, right? If I'm not mistaken. And then you have on the top there, Kaiser, right? Kaiser Merkel, sort of a more aggressive depiction, as you can see here. And many dismiss her as a mousy Hausfrau, but with ruthless cunning, Angela Merkel has made Germany master of Europe in a way Hitler and Kaiser Wilhelm only dreamt of, right? That must have been certainly from a good, reputable British outlet, I would dare to say. And then on the bottom, no, in the middle I have here, we love you. In German, wir lieben dich, right? That probably is a statement that she received a lot after saying, yes, we can, right? Make it, we can integrate and accept over 1 million refugees from the Middle East and North Africa and elsewhere. And on the bottom, you have a more, the Economist portraying her as the indispensable European, right? The one that Europe needs. So, I don't know what you think, but I think probably Angela Merkel is a little bit of all of these, right? And as a good politician, you probably have to have qualities of all of these. Everything from ruthless to altruistic to stable to being indispensable. But certainly to combine that over a 16 years period makes her an exceptional leader, no matter if it's a German leader or anywhere else. Exceptional world leader, as you see. Thank you. Yeah, but after 16 years, obviously, I mean, as you know, in parliamentarism, right, you can basically be in power as long as you want, as long as you have the majority of the parliamentary support. But, those 16 years were also some of the most stressful years in European history, in the history of the European Union. And this Economist cartoon kind of nicely expresses, I think, some of these things, right? There should have been probably Emmanuel Macron somewhere here, the French president, just trying to kind of get some of the balls that she's juggling, the stars that she's juggling. And I'm sure he will be already waiting in the line. But she's basically ready to go next. Of course, ready to go next, that's probably both in terms of sort of ready to go next. Should there be another European leadership? That's an open leadership question that we can discuss later, and I'm going to bring that up. But of course, also she's asking, who should lead Europe? Who should continue to lead Germany, right? And this was exactly, it was just interesting to see that change in the popularity, and that, in fact, we all didn't really, until very much recently before the election, believe that there would be a change, but the chancellor candidate from her own party was just not suitable for the office, right? Plus, Olaf Scholz, the former finance minister, that's the would-be chancellor now in waiting, he out-Merkeled his candidate. So, he collaborated very well with Angela Merkel. He was her finance minister, right? And so he basically literally, he was almost doing the, Angela Merkel position at some point. He really sort of portrayed to Germany, I will continue some of the stability, but I am from a different party ideology. So technically, we were able to work together with every party, but we also will have, our new certain change of certain programmatic ideas and ideals. Good, thank you. Yeah, and then just to come back to your question, because some of the question that you asked, that you wanted us to clarify, so what were some of the key policies, right? And so this Economist picture is, I think, also fairly good, because it shows you from the time when she assumed office for the first time, right, all through her 4 legislative terms till the end. Some of the highlights here, and that's, of course, the graph that goes up and down, is the approval rating. Germans who think Angela Merkel is doing a good job, right? So now if you look at that, first thing that you want to notice is look at the scale, okay? You can see here, even in the worst times, she never barely dropped below 50%, right? And if you notice in the comparative case, in the US or elsewhere, right, it's great, it's amazing if a political leader gets over 50%. Okay, so this is our sort of Putin-esque approval rating, just to joke a little bit. But so that means, generally high support throughout her legislative term. And then on the bottom, you just see sort of, in comparison, the other world leaders that she, that came and went through her term, okay? So, with that, towards the end, she really sort of became very comfortable, but she became sort of that's what part of the stability that Germany is, not only domestic, it's a domestic perception, but she also really projected German stability through her long tenure on the world scene. Now, let's look at some of the individual events. You can see here initially, of course, she wins the election, starts out at 70%, and then first visits to China, okay, in 2006. she was also one of the first, I would say, in Europe to recognize China's economic potential and, of course, the trade potential for Germany, also for the European Union, but particularly for Germany, right? Because, the German car industry is very powerful. China is, as you know, heavily developing, right? China needs lots of cars, and China has the capacity, the money, and so on to the population to buy a lot of German cars, right? So that's just one of many things. So early on, she really engaged, I think, out of sort of also the hope that, liberal engagement would eventually pay off in the Chinese government, become more, we can maybe discuss this a little bit, to the Chinese government become more amenable to multilateralism internationally, right? To become more liberal. I don't think that has necessarily panned out, right? And the new government will likely change that because of the strong stance that the Green Party has on human rights abuses. But this is the first visit to China. And then you have here the Lehman Brothers collapse, right? The beginning of the financial crisis. And here, of course, you can see here a couple developments, not only the relatively big dip in her approval rating, right? Based on the Euro crisis, Germany having this sort of ambivalent role of, being the dominant power, being seen as the austerity imposer together with the EU. But also at the same time, of course, being the one who's one of the main creditors and one of the main bailout providers, right? And there were some really nasty exchanges, not between, amongst other, the German government and the Greek government, or the newspapers in particular, which I don't want to even really get into that. But what kind of is important in contentious, and that may change also in the new government, is the debt brake insertion into the constitution, okay? So, like Germany had, remember, after reunification 1990, we had lots of financial needs domestically to kind of rebuild Eastern Germany, and some of these political culture differences are still reflected in the different socioeconomic makeup that Eastern Germany has as opposed to Western Germany, which is, I would say why the AfD, the alternative for Germany, is so much stronger in the East, for example. Okay, but so Germany was riddled with relative debt, and so that's part of the reason in 2009, after the outbreak of the world financial crisis, right, when there were additional debt payments and austerity measures necessary, that the German government, under her leadership, inserted a debt brake. That meant that Germany can only have a budget deficit of, 0.35%, which is basically zero, right? Only the European Union can afford to have, cannot really afford, but as of now, has the rule of no debts, right? And I would say this is something that corresponds a little bit also, of course, to the German history, the fear of inflation, the fear of sort of economic instability, and of course, looking at the Euro crisis, right, the fear of being an over-debted country that may eventually get problems with international financial investors, right, and just paying its bill. Obviously, we don't, just comparison here, right? Here we're talking about, 3.5 trillion that then suddenly get whittled down to 1.75 trillion, which are still immense amounts, right? And that's pretty impossible. And one of the interesting points in the negotiations, the coalition now, is that we have amongst these three parties, the Olaf Scholz Social Democrats and the Green parties, who are more amenable to potentially reworking that debt brake, and the Liberals under Lindner, who, if he was to get the finance ministry, right, he is very keen on, no further debt. We need to actually keep the debt brake. That, by the way, that debt brake was set off or was interrupted for the pandemic period, okay? But the plan is, correct me if I'm wrong, Consul General, to have it as of 2022, next year already, to re-adhere to the debt brake. So you can see here there's a window of opportunity to maybe, and I would add hopefully, get rid of the debt brake. Because I think a country such as Germany that's productive, that's competitive, can afford to make debts, right? And most macroeconomists would tell you that. The question is, of course, how much. And if you've been to Germany, and I've always, traveled a lot in Europe, Germany's infrastructure needs more debt, needs more investment, okay? If you compare that to Spain, France, Portugal, Italy, right, or anyone else. Okay, moving on. The Eurozone crisis, I think you're all familiar enough with that, but this was, of course, also defining again because of the preeminent role that Germany had, okay? And so there was a little bit of this culture wars between sort of what was considered sometimes the southern profligate states, right, and then sort of the northern industrious, saving states, and that has led to some bad blood within the European Union. And again, in the new coalition, there is now a window of opportunity to actually also press not only for the Germans to give up the debt brake, but also for joint European Union debt making. That instance had already happened once, now during Corona, because they came up with joint debt issuance for the European Union, but only for Corona, for the recovery fund of 750 billion euros. However, Olaf Scholz has signalized that he would be open to more permanently agree to German participation in joint EU debt issuance. And that's for Germans is a big deal. But he also has an ulterior motive. It's not, to kind of, because of the history of Germany or anything like that. But this divergence that we have in the macroeconomic imbalances in the European Union between countries that perform fairly well, that are more located in Northern Europe, and the ones that are struggling in the South, that's not good for the European Union as a whole, right? So if more investment is needed, German government may be open in the future to subscribe more of that common debt in the interest of stabilizing and buffering and providing more investment for the whole of the EU, particularly on the background that more investment in climate technologies, right, and a sustainable economy is needed. And the German industry and the German government is very much aware, the old one, and even more so, I think, the new one with the green parties in government, that if Germany cannot afford to invest a lot of money, it would be a misinvestment to invest a lot of money into only German climate technology if the rest of the EU doesn't do it, right? Because then who will buy German e-cars, electric cars or whatever? Okay. Another important event was the ditching of nuclear power after Fukushima. And this was one of these 180s, right, after the Fukushima nuclear reactor catastrophe, that you may remember, right? She fairly quickly abandoned nuclear energy and for the expansion of renewable energy. Now we can talk more about this later, but this is also a big issue for the new government for a number of reasons, okay? So one is, of course, the high rise of energy prices. That has to do with a lot of things, but Europe right now is suffering through a lot of high energy prices. Some say it's because, President Putin has not supplied the necessary oil and gas. Question is, should Europe remain dependent on oil and gas? Another reason was, at least for Germany, also a quick exit from coal industry, which is often seen as a bridging technology until the renewables can replace that. But so we have used coal, but there's always pressure to get more rid of coal. But our renewables production is just not up to the needs of German industry. And then that's why one of the reasons why Angela Merkel also agreed to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. You probably have heard about this. That is hated pretty much in Washington, D.C. But in order to make sure that the German industry and the German economy can rely on affordable energy, she agreed for the Nord Stream pipeline, bringing Russian gas directly through the Baltic Sea to the northern German coast. That's a transatlantic dispute that's still, and even I think for Europe, it's just not good to rely on Russian oil and gas. I mean, we can maybe debate this later. Okay. So there's still some lingering issues, right? Of course, with energy and the transition to more renewables. Now, the other point on the bottom she says, if the euro fails, Europe fails. That was clear, so the beginning of her commitment to say, like, I'll take, sort of like what Mario Draghi, the central bank of the European Union, said during the crisis also, I'll take whatever it takes, right, to save the euro, and by that, of course, again, the European Union. Is there a question or comment? Okay, good, thank you. Just making sure. Then she declares, is the next point, yes, wir schaffen das, right? Yes, we can in fall 2015. Again, I would, if I may, put a little sort of more critical spin into it while I admire sort of the symbolic humanitarianism of it. But of course, it is also well known that Germany needs immigrants, okay, particularly qualified immigrants. And remember, this was mainly about the Syrian immigrants, right, which are relatively well educated. So, I think there was an expectation that we receive a lot of Syrian doctors, nurses, professionals. But of course, migration waves are internationalized nowadays. As you know, they don't come only from one specific place, right? And sort of we had a lot of North African and Sub-Saharan African migrants, Afghani Africans, right? We have now an influx from refugees from all over the place that are flown to Belarus, and then pushed into the EU, right? But here you can see after that there was a slight dip in her approval ratings because the German people were afraid of, sort of what will this mean to German culture and identity? What will this mean in terms of security? There was, remember, 2015, all the ISIS-related attacks, Bataclan attacks in Paris, right? The Brussels attacks occurred around that time, Barcelona and so on. Then she approves the EU migration deal with Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Yes, that was the refugee swap deal with Turkey, right? Because Greece was particularly affected by an huge amount of refugees and couldn't deal with it. The Mediterranean states in general, she had this brokering solution of, okay, if we can outsource non-Syrian or non-valid refugees back to Turkey, where they should be hosted in another Islamic country, right? And then we will keep sort of the legitimate refugees in that sense. On a number of levels, that's problematic, as you can imagine, exposes European refugee policy to the wills of the Turkish government, which has not been, everyone hasn't been acting that great lately. If you followed it, it is also, in terms of humanitarian policy, really sort of unfortunate outsourcing of refugee and asylum responsibilities under the Geneva Convention, and so on and so on. And then 2017, the Bundestag approves gay marriage here at the high point. I guess it was maybe a tactical moment to do that, but she's not known as somebody who has actively really embraced the idea, right? It was more like, okay, we need to kind of catch up with the rest of Europe almost. Don't want to be the outlier with Italy and Eastern Europe. And then finally, she steps down as a CDU leader, right, as the party leader. And during the beginning of the COVID pandemic, that's also important to note, she backs the 750 billion EU recovery package, again, that's created through joint debt issuance, which was taboo pretty much through the post-war period. Okay? That's some of the key policies. I mentioned some of the challenges. Thank you. Thank you. Now, oh yeah, I didn't mention the title. Yeah, so here you can see, of course, Angela Merkel with Ursula von der Leyen, right? She's the current European Commission president. The European Commission is the EU's executive. And, they have very good relations. Ursula von der Leyen was a cabinet minister in Angela Merkel's governments. And so they don't only have I would say, probably project a trustful relationship, a fairly close relationship. But think about it strategically, what that means. Most of you are fairly well informed about the European Union, right? To have a German Commission president, right? Next to the German leader. Okay, so this Germany, in many sense, has been described in the European Union more recently as sort of the reluctant hegemon. Maybe reluctant because of its own history, but also a hegemon. And I was thinking about this when I was preparing for today. So this was actually kind of smart because, she knew that most likely she will not want to run again, right? But yet, by having now a German Commission president in 2019, and came into power in 2019 till 2024, there's also, right, a certain stability, but also power projection that continues throughout the European Union. Now, with regards to the European Union, there will be, I would say, three major issues where the new German government has to work with all the other partners, but particularly with the French government of Emmanuel Macron, because it's a French-German leadership tandem that directs a lot of what's actually happening. And remember also that, of course, Emmanuel Macron has to first get re-elected next April. So here you see also windows of opportunities, but a lot of pressure, which is, I think, one of the reasons why the German coalition tries to get into place fairly quickly, so that Olaf Scholz can take the helm and start making policies with Emmanuel Macron that they get along very well. Before, hopefully not, but before there may be a change in the French government. Okay? And that's a different, really, that's not a topic for today, but that also could have a tremendous impact, of course, on the future of the European Union, should somebody like Marine Le Pen or Monsieur Zemmour come into office, right? But so this is one thing, the joint debt issuance. To what extent will Europe make joint debt issuance permanent in the interest of the European Union, as I said, particularly in regards to sustainable climate transition and achieving those goals on an EU level? Because part of my critiques of the past years as a sort of outsider was that I think the Germans, they're a very rich country, but it was always like Germany was a little bit of a sort of an island, a rich island of happy people in a sea of misery. And by that I mean Europe, the rest of the European Union. I don't mean, the ring of fire around it, okay? And so I think there will be, what you will see is more of a genuine, and yes, I would agree what the Consul General said, that Angela Merkel looked out, tried not to divide Europe, but as every good politician, I would also say the probably her first priority was to keep the support, the domestic support of citizens, as well as, of course, the businesses, right? And that was not always in line with what other European nations wanted, naturally. So joint debt issuance will be a big issue of the future. The second one is the question of defense. However, European defense is always talked about a lot, and Emmanuel Macron has pushed the issue of what the Europeans call, or what he calls, strategic autonomy, right? Meaning sort of more independent, maybe complementary to NATO policy making, but maybe not. Germany has for a long time the debate about, to what extent should we start projecting our power again? Okay, and I'm saying here again for good reason, because of the history. And so there was a lot of hesitancy for the Germans to engage in foreign conflicts. Now I think there is a general recognition that Germany as a leading power in Europe and one of the leading power of the free world needs to, build up more capacities to protect democracies around the world, or also project power. To what extent that will actually happen in Germany as well as in the United Europe, in the European Union, it's an open question, to be very honest. I think there's always a lot of talk. There are minor gradual adjustments. We've seen this with PESCO, which is sort of a defense agreement. But, I'm not even sure many Europeans would like to see a European army, right, based on Europe's general pacifism. Probably maybe more will be channeled into sort of UN-style peacekeeping, development work. So development ministry could become more important. And the third issue is, of course, with regards to the European Union, is migration and sort of connected to it, the fragmentation of the European Union. Right? If you follow European news, you know that there's right now the if I may dare say so, some of the two problem children, right? Hungary and Poland, or the Hungarian and Polish governments that have legal issues with the European Top Court and the European Commission. Angela Merkel has tried to keep that tent together, the big tent, sometimes at the expense of, just letting the populism that these governments exerted run amok. And now I think we see some of that. And so together with the refugee crisis, where the Western Europeans have a fundamentally different attitude towards refugee intake than the Central and Eastern Europe. Same with, general diversity, LGBT rights, which is, my other specialty. I think there is sort of an unfortunate mix or tension building up between Western European countries more generally and Central and Eastern Europe. So we've seen Brexit. Hopefully that was it, but Brexit just also could have been the beginning of more to come. Whereas there was unlikely, but a possibility. Okay, thank you. If we can move on to the next one. Yeah, so this is the G20 meeting that just happened in Italy. So I just want to put this up sort of also in terms of German international foreign policy, aside from the European foreign policy, which is now intermestics, but also try to spot Angela Merkel, right? And on one hand, there's hardly any women still there, 2021. But she's, of course, noticeable, right? And I'm sure that her famous yellow jacket that was chosen, right? She wanted to be seen and certainly is in the center of G21. So this is emblematic. Oh, yeah, this is emblematic of her international stature. And then you see Ursula von der Leyen here on the side, and then the WTO chief. So in that sense, there's also this larger question, of, again, how can we credibly project German power and reputation, everything from soft power, but also to more hard power instruments, right? So much so that the new government now wants to, and that has been for the past years and debated, they want to implement a national security strategy, similar to the US security strategy or the European security strategy, right? There will be something that shows you that the Germans are really more strategically thinking about German security demands rather than sometimes what they did over the past 20, 30 years, sort of putting the head in the sand, right, and staying out of conflict. Then can we move forward? Thank you. And the transatlantic relation, of course, that's a special one, right? You can see here Angela Merkel's domineering power, right? Reminds me of sort of a BBC David Attenborough, a nature documentary, right, about dominance and submission. Then you have, of course, also here that great picture of her and former President Obama, right, in the Bavarian Alps, I think at one of the G20 meetings, just explaining, right, and they're friends, but of course also the position is quite telling. And down here you see sort of a collage of, some of the, she had obviously good relations with fellow conservative George W. Bush, right, but not as conservative as, or whatever you want to call him, Donald Trump, right, which of course, that was also an interesting relationship that they had. So in terms of transatlantic relationships, there are a couple of issues to be rectified. Nord Stream, that probably will be a continued issue. NATO is a perennial issue that is to be debated, right? And generally sort of, it is seen that to provide in terms of Germany's foreign policy in the EU and abroad, I took this quote here from, I think, the Economist survey that sort of we need to develop European Union resilience against US unpredictability, right? So this is the new status quo of the transatlantic relations. Unpredictability. And Chinese ambitions, which are growing, of course, as you know, by the minute. However, at the same time, remember, since the Biden administration has a very strong focus on China, the Europeans don't necessarily have that same sort of adverse relationship with China. And that there are some interesting triangular dynamics between these three. Now, just to finish up here, so these are some of the challenges for the traffic light coalition. Should it come together from crisis management that Angela Merkel had to do over the last 10, 15 years, right, to more strategic reforms to bring Germany and Europe into the 21st century. The pandemic, of course, is not yet over, as you know. So European numbers are going up right now. Again, because partially climatic and partially because of vaccine resistance and yada yada. With that, supply chains become an issue. It's already an issue here, but even more so in an export and import-dependent country such as Germany. Okay, so now big car manufacturers have to literally close till Christmas because they don't get the microchips. Next point is digitization and infrastructure reforms. Again, German infrastructure. So there needs to be the debt rate needs to be, I think, at least softened, and digitization in terms of 5G development, more broadband technology to involve. The transition to a sustainable economy, right, that has been in the consciousness of German policymakers and the population for a long time, but we've seen how difficult the change towards renewable energy is and was. And so to really wholesale move to a carbon neutral economy for the country that still has the highest largest CO2 emissions, despite all the environmental creds, shows you that there needs to be a lot of investment and a lot of smart policy planning and implementation occurring. Demographics. Germany also has an aging population, so again, migrants are needed. In fact, the German industry recognized and said we need 400,000 migrants a year. You just can't really sell this to the population as of yet, I think, right? So we have managed the migration waves of 2015, 2016. We can hopefully do the same, but there are still a lot of issues because a lot of those are still not participating in the labor market as productive members and are not socially integrated to the point that they should be, and so on and so on. That's not an easy issue for anyone. Domestic political polarization has increased, particularly with regards to the far right, of course, and rising inequalities. For example, one of the change of that the new government also wants to make sure that there's a decrease in social inequality. The minimum wage, will be from what's now the base, 12 euro. They're supposed to go up as well. Then the last exactly is sort of the Germany's continued role and stability of the European Union, obviously, after a decade of crisis. That's something that they need to work out together with their partners, particularly France, right? Should France have an amenable government in the future? Now, finally, I wanted to show you here, despite all of these issues, the German campaign was fairly moderate, not very contentious, for a number of reasons, right? In part because of the moderation of political German culture, but also because of the high level of wealth and sort of, that exists in general. So you see here the three posters, the campaign posters, some of the most used ones. Of course, there are different configurations of those, but you have the Olaf Scholz poster just says Chancellor for Germany, right? And there's not much programmatic content, right? But the other two then say, like Annalena Baerbock says, come, we change policies. So, okay, we need change, right? Particularly to climate protection and justice. And then Christian Lindner, the liberal, says, how it is, it cannot remain how it is. Okay, also change, but it doesn't really specify kind of what kind of change, right? No more tax, no tax increases, right? And so on. So I'll leave you with that, and I'm sure that we can have some good discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Consul General and Professor Thiel. Now we're opening the floor for questions. So if you guys have any questions, you guys can raise your hand. We'll add you to the speaker list and we'll pass the mic around. For our friends who are on Zoom, you guys can also type your questions on the chat, and I will turn on the mic for you to talk when it's your turn. Okay?
Hello, thank you for your presentations, General Consul and Professor Thiel. Just as going forward, the relationship when it comes to security and immigration between Germany and France, have we seen or will we see that same relationship as we see in France with the military-industrial complex and the government, as we see with what do we see that in Germany?
So yeah, thank you. That's a good question. Well, it appeared that in the past, even though they had a good working relationship, President Macron and Chancellor Merkel, whenever he was trying to sort of, push the German government into a stronger autonomous European defense policy, I think he was heard, but there was not much acted upon, It is still a hard sell, more military activity, by the German government. That's still a hard sell to make, okay? And then again, there's the other question of strategy, right? What kind of, where do we want to engage? If you looked at some of the recent crises, right, NATO operations or so, except for Afghanistan, right? Germany often, Libya, Syria, right, tried to stay by the sidelines. So, yeah, that's never an easy argument to make towards the German parliament or the German population at large. And plus, it costs money. And, Germany, and the military expenditures have gone up, but I think it has to do more, correct me if I'm wrong, I would like to hear your opinion if you want to, has more to do with sort of, pressure from other NATO members to achieve the famous 2%, GDP investment goal, which is not necessarily needed, but so that had more to do with international pressure, I would say, than a genuine ambition of Germany to get on par with France's power.
Thank you. And in terms of in immigration, two things. Is it still sustainable for Germany and Europe as a whole to have those immigration middlemen like Morocco, like Algeria, and like Turkey?
Well, I think you need to differentiate between those. Turkey plays a particularly important role at the moment because Turkey is sort of holding off, I believe, around 5 million or so refugees in Iraq and parts of Turkey, which would otherwise go and flood the European Union. So that's why the relationship between the European Union and Turkey is very delicate and fragile, and because on the other hand, European Union has a lot of problems with human rights violations in Turkey, obviously. But on the other hand, European societies, and particularly those in Central and Eastern European countries, are not ready to accept sort of waves of new refugees. And then every country has a different history also of immigration. I mean, Germany started in the 1960s to call for qualified workers from abroad, and Turkey was among those countries which sent a lot of those workers at the time. Many of them have well integrated into society. Many have become public figures, politicians. I mentioned Cem Özdemir, for example. But many others have not and are still sort of living in close communities where and with still strong relations to the Turkish leadership. Erdogan also comes from time to Germany and does electoral campaigns, which is a very unusual thing. German politician would never do that, whatever, to come to Florida and make electoral campaign, because we have 200,000 Germans here in Florida. Just a little comment on the defense and military issue. You have to understand that after the Second World War in Germany, well, first of all, the four victorious powers didn't want Germany to be engaged in military activities and so on. Otherwise, the European countries were trying to reach European nucleus also for defense mechanism. There was the project of a European defense community, which was sort of born in the early 1950s, but was stopped in 1954 by the French Parliament. And since then, actually, NATO integration has become sort of the main overarching issue of military cooperation, transatlantic cooperation. That actually fit probably more the German sort of German mentality and the German zeitgeist at the time than it did in France. Nevertheless, France being a nuclear power, obviously there has always been this need also for France to distinguish itself from the other European partners, or Great Britain, United Kingdom as well, as nuclear power. All these things are sort of history which is still important today. Whereas in Germany, as I said in the beginning, political dwarf, economic giant, and it also can be translated into the military terms. I mean, our Bundeswehr certainly has a number of key capabilities which are interesting. For example, to provide for integrated air defense in Lithuania or in the Baltic states. That is one of the key participations of Germany, for example, in NATO activities. But as was mentioned by Professor Thiel, the German army is a parliamentary army, and the structure of military decisions is very complicated in Germany, and it's actually the parliament which has to authorize any new doctrine or any new move or any particular mission which is decided by NATO. And that's why a Franco-German dialogue on this issue is always complicated because of a very different institutional setup. That's just a comment on the side.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, can I just quickly say something about the migration? I think that's really an issue, that needs to be solved in the European context.
But of course, therein lies the problem, right? That we have sort of a lot of polarization, Central Eastern Europe versus basically Western Europe, or Central Eastern and Southern Europe, which are heavily impacted, who feel they don't get enough, particularly in the Mediterranean, right, aid from Brussels, or from the Northern European states versus the Northern European states, who are generally also more open to receiving refugees, but have received also their large share. So, but it can't be on a nation-to-nation basis, right? That just doesn't work. That's going to be one of the biggest projects, I think, that renewed European leadership of whichever couleur needs to figure out over the next couple of years, because it will tear the European Union apart sooner or later. And it's not going to go away, right? Climate change is just beginning, and we will see many more climate refugees. There just needs to be another crisis in any of the North African countries, right? From Morocco to wherever, and this is the same thing. It cannot be that 27 different countries have 27 different views, or is Morocco a safe country to be returned to or not, right? The same with asylum acceptance rate. Cannot be that 27 different countries have totally different asylum acceptance rates throughout the European Union.
Yeah, exactly, and especially in the context of the different immigration policies. Like, for example, the policies in Poland, where they say, "Oh yeah, we do take immigrants, but only Christian Ukrainians," and those types of decisions. Thank you.
They also have elections next year, I think. So hopefully, let's hope for the best for the Polish elections.
So first off, thank you to the Consul General, to Professor Thiel, for coming and having this talk. It's been very nice. I guess what I want to ask about is the future of the Nord Stream pipeline in Germany, because obviously the United States has not been very supportive of it, and they've criticized Merkel heavily and the CDU for supporting this. Meanwhile, the Greens, I'm pretty sure, are also very heavily against the Nord Stream pipeline, obviously for climate reasons, as well as just general foreign policy perspectives within the Green Party. But how will that work when, in these coalition talks, you have three different parties that are quite different in their main goals, and having to balance that out, especially when the Nord Stream pipeline is something that could be that is very important for the energy sector of Germany?
If you remember at the time, about 10 years or 6 years ago, major sort of gas transit went through, or it's still coming through Ukraine to serve Central and Western European countries, including Germany. And there was a time that Russia and Ukraine disagreed on the price and therefore stopped actually to send any gas. And if you just have one option of that transit line through Ukraine as an end receiver in Western and Middle Europe, you're looking for alternatives. So that was sort of an energy policy decision, which is of very complex nature, obviously, but which has to be understood in parallel with the idea to become increasingly independent from foreign deliveries of any type of energy, and to increase the alternative, the renewable energies in Germany. As was said, this is by far not enough to meet the requirements for the German economy, in particular after electrification of whatever the whole car park, etc. That will not be enough. But it's one element in the puzzle of how to define your energy mix and how to manage the different the different dangers that may be to have your energy security. And so the first priority, if that is the first priority, is energy security, you have to make sure that you have multiple options, and that is one option. I'm not sure how the new government will deal with that, but in view of the situation as it is right now, and as the pipeline is now basically finished, it is a huge investment, and if it were not going to be used and the contractual obligations not be implemented, this would mean a lot of very important payments of compensation to Russia, which is also very debatable if you want to do that. So.
Plus, then you have, sort of, okay, the alternative would be to go back to coal, which is, of course, not clean, and or nuclear energy, which increasingly is, that's a big question, the next question for European policymakers, particularly since countries such as Sweden or France rely heavily on nuclear energy, right? And so there have been already the first push for President Macron to kind of get an alliance of nuclear-friendly countries to, again, bridge, to use as a bridge energy until renewables can be used. And so this is, a dilemma for the German economy.
Thank you both for being here. My question is about Germany's relations with China. Given how we both pointed out that the Biden administration is making China its priority #1, and given China is continually to flex its influence in multiple ways throughout Europe, especially in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, how do you foresee Germany tackling the middle ground of both, keeping its transatlantic partnership, especially since it views the United States as primary security guarantor, and also keeping the economic as well as its own personal views of whether it wants to be so economically tied to a country that has such less than good human rights violations? Thank you.
Well, it has been sort of the tradition in German policy to do both, to go ahead with economic investments in countries which have a promising sort of perspective and conditions. And China certainly is one of the key reasons why German economy in the past 10 years actually maintained a level of growth beyond the European average, basically. You could argue that was a good thing, but you can also argue in a more strategic thing that this is a dangerous tendency if you rely too much on that particular market. And having been myself in Vietnam for a couple of years, I know that German industry and international companies are increasingly considering also other Asian countries as a production place, and Vietnam is certainly one of them. And a number of companies are moving out of China because certain conditions are no more the same. Labor costs are increasing, which is one of the key factors why the rentability of these companies so far has been good. But on the other hand, you have big companies, car production plants, which are there, which you cannot move from one day to the other to other countries. So it's going to be obviously a long-term shift, most likely. And at the same time, the government will have to remind the Chinese government regularly about international obligations, which they have also subscribed to in the UN declarations for human rights, et cetera, et cetera. Some will call this a little bit of a lip service, but it will depend on what is happening actually on the ground. And sometimes these things also happen behind the scenes and are not being sort of put into the media immediately in order to work. So.
And on a sort of European level, it's interesting because if you think of it strategically in terms of multipolarity, right? I think Xi Jinping certainly got some pleasure out of, some of the transatlantic ruckus, right? And sort of will probably extend a hand to Europe in attempt to divide the West, as it were. Okay, and so in Europe does not, the European Union, Europe does not want to become again a pawn of a new Cold War, right? Those times, were bad enough, and I think the Europeans, once there is some stability after next year, when both governments are in power and should be able to work together, and then I think you'll see a lot more sort of strategic action from the EU level in terms of how to relate in the future. But it's going to be a careful calibration of relations. Because the new government, the German government, right, the Greens, I mean, they're hawks on human rights. And so in that sense, China is not looking that great.
Just to, I guess, understand, with the chancellor, stepping down, a lot of people will regard her as maybe the West's last defender of liberal democracy. How would you see the European Union with the rise of nationalist parties rising again? And would that be a fear of the future for example, the relations in the Eurozone and for certain issues such as the access for Turkey to join the EU?
Trying to keep it short. I can talk for hours about that. But yeah, it is a problem, and it's not as much as a problem as we thought, right? So yes, there has been a rise of far-right populist parties. Surprising rise and a scary rise. But not in the German context, okay? Because we've seen that, last time around 2017, the AfD got 17% or so. Now they're at 10%. So obviously, despite, whatever, refugee waves, yada yada yada, that didn't have an effect. However, I'm more worried, to be honest, about France, the French elections. I'm worried about Italy, right, where the far-right parties are very strong. So in that sense, I think the EU's pandemic recovery fund, in a way, was a strategic tactic to alleviate, some of the fears and inequalities in those European countries that have rising far-right powers, because now the governments could hand out a lot of basic cash and pacify ordinary citizens, right? And thus sort of prevent the a far-right takeover of some of these governments. And so yeah, this is a problem that needs to be reckoned with, but hopefully, at least in German context, I don't think it's going to be a large problem, and hopefully not for most other European countries, but we shall see.
Just one further comment. As we have seen with Brexit and the consequences of Brexit, I think as we look at it today, even those who might have favored Brexit at the time realize that this was really a bad idea. With the economic downturn, with supply chain issues, with the truck driver sort of deficit of 200,000. These are most likely being attributable to the Brexit, and do not actually. They are discouraging other countries, I think even Poland, from considering such steps. That's why I'm confident that the current conflict on rule of law issues, with Poland, which is dramatic actually, will find some kind of solution over time. What it will need, firmness from the European institutions on the one hand, but also negotiations and coaching from the European political partners. To make Poland understand the consequences if they want to opt out. Thank you.
If you don't mind, if I ask another question, good thing the PowerPoint's there. In 2015, when she declared something about the refugee crisis, that was also the year that there was a lot of, let's say, terrorist attacks, the Paris terrorist attacks, for example, and the knife attacks in Cologne. Is there still fear over that now that, there's a lot, we're going back to normalcy in Europe? Will there be some fear about the migrant crisis because of what's happened in 2015 over those terrorist attacks?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, there's a subtle, underlying fear that's always connected, right? It's sort of a mix of, grounded fears because, these things happen and, ISIS actually tried to infiltrate, right, some of the refugee streams, but also there's, it's connected to xenophobia, racism, and so on and so on. So we got to be very careful, right, to not, synonymously, put these two always together or have them overlap too much. But I think the German example has showed that except for minor incidents here or there, that overall, given the size of the intake, the refugee intake, it has been quite successful with all the problems, right, of long-term integration. There has not been a big major terrorist attack that many Germans feared. So in that sense, I think it's been fairly positive. It's been somewhat of a success.
Well, having said that, we've seen sort of I would call it a wave of anti-Semitic acts of violence, which is sort of raising concern in Germany and other countries in Europe as well. But in particular, in anti-Semitism, which is linked to the refugees, that in certain migrant communities, a new type of anti-Semitism has emerged in Germany, which was not known before, which again also influences the public opinion on how to deal with migrants, and has an adverse effect, obviously, on hospitality and things like that. So that's sort of the more underlying problem, but the fear of terrorism, of course, is still there. And if you see what you have to do at airports in order to get into an airplane, I always sort of regret the time before 9/11 when it was easy to travel in an airplane, not to talk about a pandemic. So yes, that's a real concern, and that's why also European transatlantic relations need to be further intensified, also on counterterrorism in particular. That is working well, as far as I know, but it can be done even further.
Just a quick question. After listening to both of you and engaging in Professor Thiel's course on the EU, it feels somewhat like, despite its obvious impact on global governance as a whole, that the EU, you have some serious questions about the stability and the future of the EU because of rising Euroscepticism, the migration crisis. And it seems like a lot of these issues, with Euroscepticism, become more prevalent when you have political leaders who hold these views. So my question is, how do you view the long-term stability of the EU based on this? It seems like, for such an important institution, the future stability is so dependent on the current political leanings of the member states or the leaders of the member states. And in addition to this, do you feel like Germany holds a special role to maintain this stability going forward?
Well, I'm actually also confident that this is not more prevalent right now than it has been in the past decades, actually. There has been, in many countries, including Germany, a debate about what do you invest into the EU and what do you get back? There's always a debate, are we a net payer or are we actually taking advantage of the EU? And Germany certainly is one of the biggest net payers, but Germany also, beyond proportion, it has the tools and the means and the technical knowledge to take advantage of the different funds that exist in the EU. So indirectly, a lot of reflux of money is taking can be seen in investments and so on. But a general feature of politics in all the European countries, unfortunately, is that when something goes well, the national politicians say, see what I did, very, very good project, even though that was built by the European Union, and there is also a plaque showing that. And when something goes wrong, it's very easy to point to Brussels. This is Brussels, although Brussels means the European Council or the Council of Ministers. The representatives of all the member countries were there when these decisions were taken. So there is a sort of still a very hypocritical atmosphere in many European countries, unfortunately. And I would hope that the European Commission, as a sort of master of the treaty, is paying more attention to these kinds of derogations of member states not to support the European Union, and be a little bit more transparent on what is actually coming from the EU and what not.
Yeah, and if I may add to that, I do, however, think that, you know, for the past 15 years, the EU has basically been in crisis mode almost constantly, okay? It started with the demise of the constitutional treaty, right? And it went all down, not all down in from there, but, you know, there was one thing after another. And so the EU has been in permanent crisis mode. Angela Merkel has been, you know, Europe's crisis manager for the most part. And there needs to be, that's why I would hope that there is a, you know, if the French elections go well next year, maybe even the Polish if I'm very lucky, right? And that we have sort of, you know, strong pro-European nations. But even then, there needs to be in the future a larger, broader, more strategic argument over the direction of the European Union. Because obviously, on many fronts, we see two kinds of Europe. And that idea is not new either. Even Joschka Fischer, the former Green foreign minister in 2001, 2002, had the idea. And so like, okay, maybe we need to have two different types of Europe. A core Europe that wants to be more integrated, right, on a number of issues, and sort of a more, you know, borderline Europe or less integrated Europe. Political scientists call it differentiated integration, which is a terrible term. But sort of, you know, so basically, and if I'm very honest, you know, as an observer of European politics, certain countries I would not mind seeing leaving the European Union, right? Particularly after we've seen that Brexit didn't bring down the European Union, right? If that means to have a stronger European Union. So I was never a big friend of the core Europe idea, but it seems, given the increasing fragmentation and tension in among European countries, there needs to be a stronger debate, because there seems to be a more potential France, Germany becoming more federalist, you know, a European, moving towards a European federation, and there are certainly countries who want Europe to remain more in a old school Charles de Gaulle, you know, Europe of nations, of strong nations. And these are, I think, fundamentally strategically different notions about the future of Europe. And that debate needs to be happening when there is not constantly, you know, working around crisis at various European Council meetings happening.
I have a question regarding, you guys mentioned Brexit briefly, and I know that the EU as a whole, you have places like Scotland potentially breaking off of England to rejoin the EU. How would you see that kind of self-determination affect the rest of Europe and affect Germany?
Regionalism is also sort of an old tradition in Europe. You can see it in Spain, you can see it in France, you can see it between France and Spain. Even, well, in other countries, there are regional particularities. You could even argue in Germany, Bavaria is a little bit different from the rest of Germany. But it's called a Free State of Bavaria, which, well, there are some other examples as well. But what I want to say is that the European Union also has mechanisms to deal with regional needs, and has the principle of subsidiarity, that you need to solve problems on the lowest possible level, and only if those problems cannot be solved, they go to the next level, regional, national, European, which unfortunately is not always respected, and and there are still sort of strong forces in some regions of Europe that are sort of maintaining that an independent structure and government would be more advantageous for the local population. I would argue in today's world it is inevitable to join forces and to do things even if you have to compromise on certain things. And well, the relationship between France and Germany, for example, tells you that after centuries of war against each other, they've found a way of dealing with the differences they definitely still have in approach, in culture, etc. But to manage these differences and to recognize that a mutual interdependence actually is beneficial for both. And that's what was the basic founding principle of the European coal and steel community in 1952, to put really sort of a common decision making for a common interest. And as was said before, if for example the French economy is not going on well, this has an impact on German economy, because we are sort of exporting 50% or more of our goods and so on to France. So there is an interest in Germany that to keep the French economy afloat, and vice versa. And unfortunately, the independence fighters in some of these regions don't understand that so much, or don't prioritize that. And as far as Scotland is concerned, I think after weighing all the pros and cons, they will recognize that an independent Scotland will have even more problems than they have now. That's what I would say, but you never know how these kind of internal struggles develop.
Yeah, I mean, I also would agree that, you know, in an ideal world, sort of given the Brexit experience that Britain has to go through, given the bad performance of Boris Johnson, right, that there may be a change in government, you know, there may be another, who knows, in 5 years it could be that there's another vote. Unlikely, because of the political culture in Britain, the prevailing political culture, right, of you know, insular nationalism and sort of neoliberalism that's not quite compatible with European federalist tendency. So in that sense, I would welcome Scotland, right, for a number of reasons. Ideally, you know, sort of Northern Ireland should reunite with, unlikely again, but you never know, we live in unprecedented times. But certainly the United Kingdom has never been as disunited as right now, right? So that is again opportunities, windows of opportunities to strengthen relations with the people who want to join the European Union.
May I just finish with an anecdote of my consular experience? We were talking about inflation and the dangers of inflation nowadays, and the particular sort of angst of Germans about inflation because of the hyperinflation of 1923. When I was on my first foreign posting in the US, I was in Boston, consulate, just right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so I lived through the whole period of the transition of combining the two Germanys, the unification, etc. And at one point in mid-1990, a monetary union was decided among the two Germanys before uniting politically. And at that time, also an exchange rate was decided between sort of the East German and West German currency, the Mark and the Deutsche Mark, and an exchange rate of 1 to 1 or 1 to 2 was decided. Even though the black market actually, on the black market, the East German, you had to pay 10 East German mark for 1 West German mark. And we actually received at the consulate in Boston some letters with sort of money inside, and some of the paper money we received were about 125 million mark, and they wanted to exchange that into the current German currency. And then, well, we had to send that back with the regret and saying, well, unfortunately, that was back from 1923, from the hyperinflation, when you could buy just a loaf of bread with that sum. So, yeah, you have to take historical perspectives really at the time period where it belongs to.
Thank you so much for the ending of the conversation, Consul General. And I know that it's a long conversations. However, I do think that our audience have a better look of how the fate of the EU is going to be and how Germany is going to possibly become, like after the new government transition. So again, I would like to say thank you so much for our two speakers today. If you don't mind, we would like to take a group photo with the Consul General and the professor. So if you don't mind, we can all do that together. And you guys are all welcome also.